Hello, I'm Lauren from the IG Schools team at Inside Government, and today I'm joined by Professor Sonia Blanford, the founder and CEO of Achievement for All, and Tony McAlee, the Research Director at the Education Development Trust. And we're going to be discussing the impact of COVID-19 on disadvantaged children and young people, and what can be done over the summer and into the next academic year and beyond to help make up for the lost learning time during the lockdown period. Tony and Sonia are going to be sharing some practical advice and guidance for school leaders, teachers and support staff working in primary and secondary schools, including special schools and pupil referral units. And we'll not only be looking at England or the UK, but also considering how countries across the world have been reaching and supporting disadvantaged pupils during this time, and what can be learned from these different approaches. So let's start with an introduction from you both, and if you can each provide a bit of background, a bit more information on your role and expertise. So Sonia, if you'd like to start, and then we'll go across to Tony.
So thank you very much, Lauren. I'm Sonia Blanford. I'm the CEO of Achievement for All, a charity, a not-for-profit that was established now almost 10 years ago. We started delivering programmes to schools in 2011. We've now extended it to early years settings and post-16 settings. Essentially, we're set up to provide support for leaders, teachers, parents, carers, children and young people in order to be able to meet the challenges, whether they are COVID-19, as we are currently engaged with, or special educational needs and disadvantage generally. My own background is that I was a child born into a family of acute disadvantage. Some of you may have come across my book, Born to Fail, which shares some of my life story, but also the research around disadvantage and the failure of the system to be able to support children and young people over many years, over many decades, and the importance of engagement with parents, carers, and the importance of engagement with leaders. My most recent publication is the Social Mobility Chance or Choice, which looks into how we can work with within employment, within universities, within FE colleges, and looking to the future of how, as a society, we can provide a mutual response to any of the disadvantages that people within families, outside of the family situation, or just as individuals, the level of disadvantage that they face.
Thanks, Sonia. And Tony?
Thanks, Lauren. Hello, everybody. My name is Tony McAlee. Very pleased to be here. As Lauren said, I'm the Research Director for Education Development Trust. You may know us under our previous title. We used to be called CFPT. And we're a not-for-profit education organization. We've been around for over 50 years. And we basically work with governments in many different countries on different facets of school reform and teacher development. We do quite a bit of work for the DFE in England. We've also got quite a big profile in Africa on projects funded by the Department for International Development and the Middle East and the Far East. In England, in addition to our work for the DFE, we provide career services to schools, particularly in London. We've got a national program supporting school-to-school peer review, a very large program. It's called the School Partnership Program, SPP. And relevant to today's discussions, we run a centre for teacher development in London, the London Connected Learning Centre, which focuses on support for schools on the use of education technology. And just now, my colleagues at CLC London have been very busy working with their partner schools on the management of the learning continuity challenge in the context of school closure. In addition to all that, we produce research, and it's my responsibility to look after our research portfolio. And just now, we've published a series of reports looking at the educational response to the COVID-19 crisis from a global perspective. So looking not so much at what's been happening in the UK, but what's been happening in the world in terms of the response to the amazingly difficult challenge of school closure.
Great, thanks Tony, and thank you Sonia as well. So now before we kind of dive into what support can actually be offered, can I ask each of you first to maybe reflect on the impact so far of COVID-19 on disadvantaged pupils? Perhaps Sonia, you can go first.
Yes, thanks, Lauren. Achievement for All, we're currently engaged with 2,000 settings across England and Wales. That's schools, early years and colleges. And we've been very actively in contact with those schools, colleges and settings over the last 4 months since the start of the pandemic. We have found that there are basically 3 or 4 issues that schools and colleges and early years settings have had to address. First was the immediate issue of the digital leadership, the digital technology, and providing access for the whole community that they serve in being able to communicate, not just in terms of lessons, but also the networks and keeping those communities going. And that has been a huge, huge pressure for the disadvantaged community. And there's been some research outside of the work that we've done. There's been other research from the National Federation of Educational Research, School Zone, Sutton Trust, amongst others, that have suggested that there hasn't been an equity of provision in an availability of that connectivity, which is actually fundamental to any form of development and learning, where the human race needs that connectivity. We need to be able to understand what's happening across our communities. So digital literacy and digital leadership has been a huge issue. Then related to the whole issue is the problems that have been experienced by a significant number of disadvantaged young people and children, and that relates to well-being. So we've heard anything from free school meals through to the way in which families have been disrupted, the pressure that this is put on. It's put on all families, but particularly those that face challenges. If I just share with you, at one point, a school had contacted me about 6 weeks ago, saying that over that weekend, there were 125 families that simply weren't going to have food for the weekend. So we know that in terms of disadvantage, it comes from that basic Maslow hierarchy of needs, that we need that security, we need food, we need a place of safety. And again, that comes back to the connectivity that can be provided. And then finally, it's around the leadership and the way in which the pressure that this has put on certain areas of the country. And they're not just regions that are commonly known through the opportunity areas, but pockets within the more affluent areas where the level of disadvantage is quite acute, and where that has reached pressure points for nursery provision, for school provision and for college provision. I happened to have a conversation with a college leader last week, where it was amazing the lengths that people were going to within her staff teams to be able to provide support for the 16 to 24-year-olds particularly, who were finding the whole experience of the pandemic, particularly as they are located in an area, housing estates of acute disadvantage, from food, from the way in which certain people were being pressed into undesirable activities. Anything that we can think of was happening, and that particular college was providing very, very detailed day-to-day support for their students. So we hear of, absolutely beyond the norm support, but the context that we're working with in disadvantage, that social mobility, that social class difference that we experience in this country has definitely become, as I used the word several times in responding, it's become more acute. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonia. That was really, really insightful. And Tony, would you like to add something there as well?
Yeah, sure. I'm really interested in what Sonia just had to say, and it rings a number of bells for me actually in terms of our reflections on some of the international trends. And I like a lot what Sonia said at the end about the need to identify both the level of the challenge, but also some promising practice in terms of responding to the challenge. And that emphasis on detailed day-to-day support, that was the phrase Sonia used, that sounds absolutely right to me and consistent with what we've been seeing in our international study. So what have we seen? Well, we tend to be a little bit, insular here in this country, but actually all the challenges that we're facing are global challenges. And school closure has been highly problematic for disadvantaged students across so many countries. And across, if you like, all the different dimensions of disadvantage, whether it's poverty, disability, gender, ethnicity, it's been challenging, more challenging maybe than for other folks. And there's this massive question, challenge of equity, isn't there? The debates we've been having in this country, the problems we've been having in this country are echoed in so many other countries. I think response has been made more difficult in this country, but in others as well, because of the relatively decentralized nature of the school system. Other decentralized systems, such as Germany and the USA, have also had kind of coordination challenges, particularly in terms of what the right response should be for disadvantaged students. There have been legal arguments in the USA about the duties of school boards towards students with high levels of special needs. A high level of unhappiness in Germany about the inappropriateness of the online offer for some children with special needs, about how unrealistic some of the assumptions are about online learning when kids are living in quite difficult households. So everything that we've been wrestling with, other people have also been wrestling with, because it's not easy. There's been a significant emphasis on trying to bridge the access gap in terms of the digital divide. How can we provide disadvantaged households, economically disadvantaged households with devices? This has been a challenge here. It's been a focus challenge elsewhere. I think in the middle of that, there's tended to be a rather simplistic set of assumptions about the learning benefits that will arise if you get access. You need access, but maybe not enough emphasis on, well, what do you do with the technology. So lots of challenges. I'd like to home in, as Sonia did, on some more promising practice, though. And for me, the lessons that we may be learning from the closure may be irrelevant to the reopening. So the countries where I think they've done interesting things have tended to have an emphasis on role specificity. What are we supposed to do? Okay, so I'm a special educational needs coordinator in a primary school. What should I do? Clarity and accountability about roles. Really drilling down to the level of the individual students in terms of tracking and data. Focusing, of course, on communications with families and caregivers, and stressing the need for effective multi-agency working. So those are things I've seen in, I think, interesting policy in other countries, and I think they're going to be relevant for reopening. If I could just home in on a couple of countries where I think the practice has been impressive. South Korea was very systematic in terms of measuring the challenge at the level of every individual household, right? They've got 5.5 million school kids in South Korea, and every single kid was assessed, kind of audited via their school in terms of online access, access devices, and the appropriateness of provision in terms of special needs. And they identified 223,000 students who didn't have the right kit and they gave all those kids the right kit. So they managed at the level of the individual household to provide kit and to provide internet access. And then there was real clarity about what class teachers, form teachers, if you like, were expected to do by way of the daily checking of engagement for all kids, but of course, including students facing different forms of disadvantage. And in contrast with the figures from lots of countries, including this country, actually the level of engagement of disadvantaged students in the offer was extremely high. Now, I know South Korea, it's a different place, it's a different culture, etc. I'm not saying it's easy to bottle these things, but I think there are some lessons from that case study. And then finally, France. So we're decentralized. Guess what? France is centralized. And it's interesting to see the way they approach things. Big emphasis on this phrase I used of role specificity. So what am I supposed to do as the head of a primary school or a special needs coordinator? Real clarity about that, and the way in which multi-agency working should be sustained in the context of school closure. An emphasis on ensuring that individual students have the right adaptive technology for home learning. Role specificity for classroom assistants, explaining what you should be doing every day in terms of contact with the families of vulnerable students. Quite an imaginative program for trying to redress the imbalance. We all know that in terms of home learning, disadvantaged households, in terms of access to well-educated adults, sometimes it's more difficult. So what can you do? Really imaginative scheme in France, buddying up high school students with online with undergraduates at universities, so that they actually had, if you like, a kind of smart, well-educated friend that online they could talk to about the work that they were doing, the subject work that they were doing. Some quite interesting practice. But what I read in both those case studies actually was 100% what Sonia said about this detailed day-to-day support. Thanks.
Brilliant, thanks Tony. And yeah, I think that's really interesting, but really useful as well to be able to draw comparisons with different countries across the world and different contexts, especially when there's some good practice that maybe we can learn from and pick up and try and implement in our context as well. So if we can talk a bit more now, I think, about the kind of support that can be provided, and maybe any ideas that each of you have about what can be done over the summer holidays specifically. And there was kind of talk about extending the summer term in Wales. There was going to be an extra week on, but then that got kind of rescinded. But those 6 weeks holidays are obviously a really crucial time to try and make up a little bit of a gap that's being created. So how can schools or other practitioners help facilitate any activities or any catch-up time over the summer holidays? And of course, like we've already mentioned, kind of wanting to be mindful that different children will have different access to online learning facilities, or even, access to the internet, or, what can be done to kind of identify even, to start with, what kind of access children have got. Tony, you mentioned some examples there of what being done in South Korea, for example, to kind of map that before distributing any kind of activities. So yeah, any ideas you have for what can be done over the summer, and how to make sure that any catch-up activities are accessible to everybody. So Tony, perhaps you'd like to pick up again first.
Yeah, sure. I'll say a few words, but then I'll hand over to Sonia. I suspect Sonia, in the context of England and the UK, has got more detailed, specific thoughts. I think, what I said a moment ago about good practice in the lockdown, I think that will continue into this, the catch-up phase and the reopening phase, in terms of clarity about what we're expecting of our colleagues, the importance of communication, the importance of data and tracking individual levels of participation, and also an assumption that this is going to be difficult. And so we will need to be particularly energetic and proactive in terms of, first of all, ensuring participation in any catch-up activities. There was an article last week in the French newspaper Libération in which a head teacher was talking about this and saying, you know, that we've got to understand how tough this is going to be. This person said, what are the chances that a student disengaged during lockdown is going to say, hey, it's the holidays, I'd better go to school? So that's what somebody was saying last week in France. And yeah, it's a challenge. So we've got to really, really, you know, home in on the detail here in terms of promoting participation, tracking participation, communicating with parents and caregivers about the value of the catch-up offer. I think my own advice would be that we try to make the catch-up as fun as possible, and as if you like, kind of rich as an experience as possible, and not just a crash course in lost literacy and numeracy learning. The government in London, it's putting this emphasis on tuition, and you know, that's fine. You know, it's based on the evidence and what EF say, and I have no problem with that at all. It is interesting, again, comparing it with other countries. The French have taken a different approach. The French government is spending 200 million euros, giving 1 million disadvantaged students a week-long learning holiday that combines academic catch-up with lots of opportunities for, if you like, social catch-up and social interaction in a healthy, safe environment. And you know, we can't do that here, but I think the spirit of that, in terms of thinking, you know, about the whole child and the need to focus on, if you like, kind of social catch-up and emotional catch-up, as well as academic catch-up, I think that's something that leaders in this country should be thinking about. And linked to that, a focus on, of course, measuring and remediating academic learning loss, but going beyond that in terms of understanding other forms of loss, psychosocial damage that has been caused, which is likely to be so much the greater for some disadvantaged students. Attention to the safeguarding issues that maybe have sadly, you know, manifested themselves as a result of lockdown, the heightened possibilities of different forms of abuse during lockdown, and our professional responsibilities for seeking to, you know, monitor, respond to that. The heightened risk, for example, that there's been a violence towards girls and women. I mean, the context is very different, but this was a big, big lesson from the reopening of schools in Sierra Leone after 9 months of school closure after Ebola in 2014. That the girls had a particularly tough time, and we need to be really, really vigilant for these safeguarding issues as well. So just a couple of thoughts, but I'll hand over to Sonia.
Thank you, Tony. On the need to provide really core strength support, that psychological support, the social support. We have some free resources which I think Lauren is going to be circulating with this podcast. And what we've done at Achievement for All is we've created a framework that builds that confidence and ability to learn. And that's what's being lost. It's that confidence and ability to learn. So reaching out to hard to reach families, engaging those hard to reach children and young people, engaging the parents and carers who perhaps have been so removed from activities around schools, around learning, around early years provision, around post-16 provision. So we've put together some quite fun activities around the core strength. And it's predicated on the idea that actually your brain is a learning engine that we need to have, that mental toolkit. We need to be able to support the growth of the brain. It's actually a quite an exciting way of viewing the lack of engagement, and to re-engage those children and young people through learning activities. So besides the sort of more educational view, we've got very detailed activities for parents, carers, for the leaders themselves actually, and also teachers and children and young people. So it's a framework that's accessible, and it's easy to understand, and it's easy to apply. And that enables people to acknowledge and celebrate even the smallest amounts of learning. Because I think one of the issues, I was on a call the other day where parents were saying, well, actually, it's a huge gap. You know, how are we going to re-engage? Exactly your point about the French comment in the paper from the head teacher. How are we going to re-engage with these young people? So we've been working with those hard to reach in order to be able to provide that toolkit, to be able to provide access. And it's an approach that we hope, based on our work that we've been engaged with the hardest to reach in the community, that we are able to re-engage and re-motivate children and young people to learn through these activities that are very accessible. Now, where we started with this was actually South Korea. So we've been working in a partnership with some schools in South Korea now for 10 years. And given that these schools were 6-8 weeks ahead of us in terms of having to resolve some of the issues, we looked at the activities that they had to engage, that day-to-day absolute attention to detail, not just the recording of where their students were and how the students responded, but how many students accessed learning, what the situation was at home in terms of the number of devices that a family had. So where there were 4 children, for example, how would they provide and how would they plan their day to enable all 4 children to be able to access the learning? So we've incorporated all of that knowledge and experience, and we're still in weekly contact with the schools in South Korea to be able to inform some of our work, as well as our contacts, as I said earlier, with preschools, with the schools, 2,000 schools that we're in partnership with, and with the colleges. Attention to detail, what we mean by that is we've seen the need to deliver devices, but not just deliver the devices, but the connectivity. So we've helped with that digital literacy, we've helped provide support for that knowledge base in terms of what does it mean to be able to provide. So our coaches that have been active in the last 6 weeks have been in discussions with leaders, with those providers on what exactly is needed. And the digital literacy partnership that we have with Microsoft, although that's applicable to any device and any platform, is how to actually get those connections working, how to make sure that the digital literacy, that level of understanding, then becomes a given at home, rather than an assumption that all homes have this knowledge and have the Wi-Fi connectivity. So we're providing support there, and that's very much provided in our online support that we've got on our website. We've got it through two ways in there. So there's the COVID-19 leadership, and then there's the more detailed core strength that I've been referring to, and that's free to access. So just to go on to the Achievement for All, Google Achievement for All, and there'll be the access. And that's open to any leader, any parent, any carer, any teacher, and any student who wants to access those resources. But as Tony outlined, the importance of that clarity, importance of being able to provide that level of a connection. And then finally, what we've been doing is discussing and working with our schools, where we've been able to talk about the community connectivity. So we've been looking at what else can be provided. So you may have heard of street games, and street games has been given some of the funding to provide some of the food banks and the meals for students over the summer break. So we've been providing this connectivity and this engagement with learning alongside street games and the provision for food, the basic necessities of life. So that gives you an outline, but as I say, if you go to the Achievement for All website, you'll be able to access this information and the materials, and that's what's important. It's the materials that are just within a click available for any early years school or college provider. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you both. I mean, so much to think about there. That's, fantastic, I think, for so much support for school leaders. And, as Sonia said, we'll make sure that all those links are listed below this recording, so you'll be able to access those resources really, really easily. And so as we start to think about, the longer term process, and I think a lot of the points that are really going to be really key here, you've both already mentioned, but beyond the summer into the new academic year, what can schools be doing now to prepare for September? And what kind of support do you envisage they might be needing to provide at that time when pupils are starting to come back and, hopefully being ready to re-engage by then, even if they're not so much ready over the summer holidays? Sonia, if you'd like to carry on and start on that one.
Yeah, so I think we're going to be working within a new frame. The frame of activity, that it's not going to be returning to schools as we know it. We're absolutely going to be looking at a completely new way of engaging with learning, partly because of what we've experienced through the blended learning experience over the school closure, but also in the way in which schools have engaged with vulnerable learners, because we mustn't forget that schools have been opened for those vulnerable learners, where they've been able to make that contact, where those students have been able to attend. It's quite a small number proportionate to the total school community and the total that have been in need. So I think there's going to be a very different world, in terms of, and I think that's a given, that we need to look at what's happening within those schools in terms of well-being, not just of the students, which has been the focus of our conversations today, but also in terms of the way in which we're working with leaders and teachers, because they're going to be anxious as well about what's being provided. The hard to reach families and how those hard to reach families are going to be connected. The digital literacy, I've mentioned that before, and Tony's mentioned that, and how we engage with digital literacy. And then finally, the transition, because every child that starts school in September is going to be in a different class, in a different year group, in a different with a different curriculum, in a different, so that whole transition. And again, we have some resources to be able to provide guidance and support for teachers and leaders to prepare for September in terms of those transitions. And we mustn't forget that this, traditionally is a period of transition, and all of those anxieties that relate to transitions and those needs for planning around transition remain. They haven't gone away. The 6-week break is a 6-week break. When students, when the children and young people return, they will be, as I said, in a different class, in a different year group, in a different social group maybe. But the teachers also will have that transition to make, as will the leaders, which is a piece of work that we've been focused on over the last 20 weeks. To be able to provide again support for the communities prior to when they return, and as they do return, and ongoing support from September. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonia. And Tony, if you'd like to add anything.
Sure, just a couple of thoughts, and I agree with absolutely everything that Sonia's just said. I think we need to expect a high level of anxiety generally. There is a high risk of absenteeism, and it is highly likely that those levels of absenteeism will be more marked amongst certain groups. And I think we need to be, proactive in seeking to mitigate that risk in a relentless attention at the detailed level to ensuring re-engagement and, if you like, re-enrollment at the level of the individual disadvantaged student and his or her family. The lessons from Sierra Leone after Ebola in 2014, I mentioned it a moment ago, the schools were closed for 9 months, was that lots of the children just didn't come back. And that certain groups were less likely to come back. And okay, it's different here, but we've really got to be mindful of the need to persuade parents, reassure parents and the kids that it's safe to come back, and really tackle this potential problem of absenteeism. We need to be agile, because we don't know what's going to happen in terms of, let's hope it's not going to happen, a second wave, and let's hope we're going to have a vaccine, etc., etc. But we need to be agile. And as leaders, we need to be managing different scenarios. We need a plan for several fairly obvious scenarios to do with the possibility of a second wave and, school closure, to do with the high likelihood of future local lockdown. And in the systems that have reopened, such as France and South Korea and China and Israel, there have already been local school lockdowns after school reopening. Just to end maybe on a rather more upbeat note, that there is a challenge trying to create the space to think about education rather than just thinking about health when we, conceptualize reopening, which is entirely understandable. First base, let's make sure that the children are safe and healthy. Of course, that's understandable. But that understandable concern, I think, looking at the kind of international discourse, has squeezed out most of the discussion about the topics that Sonia was talking about in terms of, what have we learned about blended learning? What have we learned about the use of technology? And I think we've got to, as leaders, create the professional space to think about learning as well as thinking about the health protocol. And that's not going to be easy, but we've got to do that as leaders. I was looking at the school reopening plan for the state of California, which is a very thoughtful document, but it's kind of all about health and nothing about education and learning. So there's California, home of Silicon Valley and home of the great tech companies. But in this 65-page guidance, it's something like that. There's only one reference to computers, and it's an instruction not to let students share devices. And I read that and I thought, oh, that kind of encapsulates it. The preoccupation with health squeezing out the necessary conversation that we must be having about learning, the positive opportunity to talk about, points around the teacher professional development needs that we've now identified, the good lessons we've learned about what worked in terms of technology-enabled learning. So finding the space for that will be my final piece of advice. There is a lot of advice out there from international agencies that colleagues might like to look at. So the World Bank and UNESCO and the OECD, the people who organize PISA, have all issued advice related to the management of the COVID-19 crisis. So I know everybody's busy, but if you've got a chance, I'd advise you to check out some of that advice. And if you were to choose just one, I'd choose the World Bank advice. I think it's particularly thoughtful. And they use this slogan when talking about the reopening. They say, we've got to build back better. And I think that's the challenge for leaders. Not going to be easy, but we've got to try and build back better. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you both. I mean, that's great. I think, there's some really, really important things that you've highlighted there. And I think a lot of school leaders will really be appreciating this opportunity to start considering some of these issues that you've highlighted. I think this has been such a useful and informative conversation. And just before we wrap up, I just wanted to give you both another opportunity to add any final comments on this or highlight any additional resources. Tony, you gave the World Bank a good plug there, but if there's anything else that you wanted to direct people to or anything from the EDT at all, feel free. And then Sonia, if there's anything you wanted to add as well.
Sure, thanks very much, Lauren. Well, if you'd like to know more about what we get up to, including all of our research, then just go to our website, just Google Education Development Trust, and you'll see more there about who we are, and there'll be links to all of the research, including the research that we've done on the response to the emergency. And as I say, if you're interested in our organization more generally, maybe in terms of our work in the UK on the careers side, or the support for peer review, or our Connected Learning Centre in London, then you'll be able to find all the links there. So that would be my advice.
Thank you. And Sonia, was there anything you wanted to add?
There's just one more group, disadvantaged group, that we haven't mentioned that I'd like to just draw attention to, and that's children looked after, those that are fostered, adopted, or are in care. And over the last 5 months, the way in which the pandemic has impacted on that group has been quite profound. These are people that have, by their very nature, have issues with attachment. They have issues with being able to connect with others. They have issues around perhaps more special educational needs than the majority of the population. When Tony was referring to attendance as an issue, one of the areas that we've been working on for 10 years is exclusions and the heightened reality of children looked after and what happens in their world, and the way in which their world becomes very complicated when there's the frame of their world yet again changes and yet again disappears. So we have looked at the way in which children looked after are supported through the well-being. And it's to Tony's point, really, is to ensure that whatever we do is connected to learning, not just the health and well-being, although that's obviously you can't learn unless you're healthy and you have at least a journey, you're on a journey of well-being. But in order to be able to learn, there needs to be a frame of reference. So my final comment is that when we're talking about disadvantage, this is so multi-layered, but there are some groups that perhaps are more impacted by social change that's been generated by the pandemic and the way in which the society has had to be able to respond. And we must, when we work in our communities, when we lead the schools, when we lead early years, when we lead colleges, we have to think about every single pupil, every single day, every single lesson, every single engagement with our teachers. It's that attention to detail, but also thinking as broadly as we possibly can about that school community and those groups that are really compounded by any change, and those that have even prior to COVID-19 experienced some quite dramatic things in their lives, and that again is really profound during the last 5 months. So I'll just end on that point.
Thank you, Sonia, and yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that you did be able to mention that at the end there, because, as you say, a really important kind of group not to forget at all in these conversations. So thank you again both for all your contributions today. It's been, as I say, a really, really useful and interesting discussion. and hopefully really helpful for those on the front line of implementing this kind of support for children and young people. All the resources mentioned, as I say, will be available underneath this recording for everybody to access really easily, and to be able to revisit as well in the coming weeks and months as each early year setting, school, trust, pupil referral unit develops their own strategies around being able to help pupils catch up as much as possible. So thank you again both, and all the best with your ongoing efforts to improve education standards everywhere.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.